Good morning, everyone. Our photographer, he has a very strange name. He sent me a photograph in which Dr. Mukul, Kesavan and me were in one frame. It was a four-piece photograph. So I wanted to call him Cartier Bresson, but then I changed it to Andy Warhol because you have the four-piece Monroe. So I wanted to boast of this to my daughter, so I sent this photo to her. Changing the hierarchy. I put a caption, Mukul Kesavan with Harry. So this morning she sent me a reply with a very sarcastic emoji. And she said, I met his hero, anonymous hero in Benares. She was recently in Benares. So I began by saying this because during the period 1995, for about 10 years, Mukul Kesavan was a blockbuster in Kerala. To use a Kerala metaphor, I would say, for about 10 years, Mukul Kesavan and Amitabh Ghosh, you were the Mammootty and Mohanlal at the seminars. I remember listening to papers where young students studied you through the looking glass as surf fiction, as fabulation, as historic fiction, and studies on time. And in those days, film studies had not matured, but even film studies were used. And one beautiful paper I remember was one young girl had, I remember all this in the morning. One young girl had even presented a paper using the Bergsonian concept of time continuum. So you were such a hit in those days. And so I'm so excited to be moderating this session. And I'll go back in time, become a student, and go there and listen to you. I'm sure it's going to be a blockbuster. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Hari. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I wrote that down so long ago that it feels sort of vaguely archaeological when someone refers to it. But it's nice to know that someone read it, the people really enjoyed it. I wanted to say that it's been a real pleasure to be here, to be in Bishopmore. It's not a part of Kerala that I know at all, and the hospitality that we've received has been overwhelming. I particularly like to thank Amit and Prinjit and Siddharth for their hospitality in showing us around. And it's been a real pleasure to be here yesterday, to listen to Akar talk about the challenges of the present moment and what a Nehruvian figure might actually make of him. This is an incredibly important conjuncture, a really important political conjuncture in our time. And it's completely understandable that we should use Nehru as a kind of proxy for all that is good in our republic. And this is particularly the case because the present political establishment often uses Nehru as a symbol of all that is bad. So it's a reasonable reaction for us to, if not spring to his defense, at least invoke his memory and the things that he is associated with as a defense of what we think is beleaguered at the present moment. My topic, as was said earlier, is the Nehruvian state and pluralism. And I choose pluralism as a description advisedly, deliberately, because I think one of the problems with invoking Nehru in a kind of vague, fuzzy way of using him as as your shield or your defense against the present moment is that you often fall into the temptation of using the vocabulary that we inherited from the Nehruvian world to try and describe and analyze our present moment. And I think three of the terms that all of us, regardless of what our age is, inherited from that moment were the three terms nationalism, secularism, and communalism. I remember both in school and in college, there were certain historians who were, if you will, very much on the side of the progressive world. I'm thinking, for example, of Bipi Chandra, who would use the idea of secularism and the idea of communism as kind of a battle for India's soul. And nationalism was essentially seen as secular nationalism. I'd just like to say that these are useful terms standing by themselves, but when they're knit together, they often add up to a conversation, to a discourse that can be misleading, which is why I don't use secularism or communism or even nationalism. I just use the term pluralism because the argument I'm going to make here is that the nationalism that Nehru and the Congress stood for, and I use Nehru and the Congress because I think when we talk about the Nehruvian state, when we talk about a Nehruvian ideology, we're actually talking about something that Nehru represented but didn't invent. That he was as much an heir, a legatee of that set of ideas as we are. But he's a useful person to embody those ideas. And I think the central idea, the most valuable and crucial idea that Nehru embodies is the idea of a kind of ideological pluralism. Let me just explain what I mean by this. Generally speaking, when you use the term nationalism in the West, if you in Western newspapers and magazines, when people say so is nationalist, it's not meant as a compliment. And this was a shock to me when I went abroad to be a gratitude, because I assumed that nationalism was a sattvic thing. Nationalism was a benign thing, it's a good thing. Because that's how nationalism was always received by us in school and college. It was a good thing. In the West, however, when someone says that Putin is nationalist, or Viktor Orban is nationalist, or Trump is nationalist, or Marine Le Pen is nationalist, they don't mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a criticism. Because nationalism in the West often represents a kind of dark chauvinism, an exclusionary solidarity that seeks to create, in the name of the majority, a nation state that treats minorities as less than equal. In India, however, there is no such connotation. I think there are two main reasons for this, that they both have to do with this notion of the Nehruvian state and pluralism, as I tried to say. The reason nationalism in India is seen as good, benevolent, sattvic, not tamasic, the way in which it's used in the West, is that, number one, nationalism in India was anti-colonial. Because it had, if you will, the glamour, the sex appeal of being anti-colonial, something that actually fought for liberation and for freedom, it in a sense automatically was seen as good. But there are lots of anti-colonial nationalism that often turn sour, that become authoritarian, that begin to turn upon their own people. And that's the second reason why Nehruvian pluralism is seen as a good thing, because the nationalism of the Congress was a singular thing. It was an eccentric thing. It was born of a particular historical time and place, a kind of coming together in the late 19th century. And it was a genuinely weird ideology. When I say weird, what I mean is, when the Congress is founded in 1885, it's not really a party. It's a sabha that meets once a year. They have a kind of meeting once a year, and they pass a series of resolutions, and that's it. But even though on the face of it, this seems like a completely trivial, uninteresting organization, we know that it wasn't trivial or uninteresting simply because it became the behemoth that it did. And the reason it became that is that it found a peculiar way of phrasing its claim to represent the nation. What the Congress said was this, in short. It said that in our membership, we represent the diversity of India, and therefore we represent India. It's a simple assertion, but in the context of nationalism, a completely eccentric one. If you think of contemporary nationalisms in this time in Europe, and the Congress thinks of these all the time, congressmen are constantly talking about Bismarck and in Germany and Mazzini and Garibaldi in Italy, because these are very cosmopolitan figures, they read newspapers, they travel abroad. So they're constantly referring to these figures who represent these Central European nationalisms. As you know, Italy becomes a nation state in 1870 and 71, as does, in fact, Germany. But these European nationalisms are completely the inverse of Congress nationalism. Because what is Mazzini and Garibaldi, what are they saying? They're saying that Italy deserves to be self-determining, it deserves to be a nation state because it is one people. And what do they mean by one people? They mean one homogeneous people. Homogenized by language, possibly even homogenized by faith. That they're Italian speaking. This is actually true. Italy at this point of time speaks dialects that are so different. I mean, the Neapolitan dialect in the south and the Milanese dialect in the north could be two different languages. But the claim that's made is they are fundamentally the same language. They therefore together deserve to be a nation state. And Bismarck makes similar, slightly different arguments to this effect. But that's not the argument the Congress is making. Congress is literally saying we represent India because we represent its diversity. And I think we should take a moment to appreciate how singular and strange this argument is. Why does it make this argument? And why does this argument actually succeed? It makes this argument because of weakness. As I said to you a moment ago, the Congress is nothing. It's a bunch of broadly English-speaking notables from different parts of India, generally from its bigger towns and cities, who meet once a year and pass resolutions. It doesn't have an organization for the first 15 years of its existence. It has no being for the whole of the year till it meets again. It has no capacity to mobilize anyone. And it certainly doesn't have a single working class person or peasant or plebeian or subaltern or whatever you want to call lower class people in its ranks. And it has to make the claim to represent a nation to a skeptical Raj. There's no reason for the British. It's not in the interest of the British to acknowledge that any organization represents the people that it rules. The Raj doesn't even accept that India is a nation. It thinks of India as a bunch of principalities and regions that it has conquered, and that its unity is based upon the Raj's initiative in conquering the subcontinent. So, when the Congress actually makes this claim, what it's saying is that we have no real argument through which we could persuade either the Raj or indeed the people that we claim to represent that we represent. Because we are so elitist and we are so ephemeral. We don't actually have an organization. So what they're essentially saying is this: they're invoking a kind of census imagination. Remember the first census is done in 1872. What the Congress is doing is it's saying that if you think of the subcontinent and its diversity of people, in ourselves we represent this diversity of people. If India is visualized as a kind of jungle, the Congress is a compact version of that jungle. It's a human zoo. That in its different enclosures are available all the human species of India. So it's an attempt to leverage an idea that is current. Remember, in 1877, Lord Lytton holds a darbar. What is a darbar? The darbar literally was a gathering of everyone that the colonial state thought was important in India, getting them within a single tent and getting them to pledge allegiance to the King Emperor. And there's a lovely story about a great early moderate nationalist called Sir Surendra Banerjee. And Surendra Banerjee happened to be in Delhi when Darbar was held. And he looked at this gathering of people and said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a gathering like this, not to pledge fealty to the English emperor, but to represent us as a subject. Now, it's one of those stories that is frequently told, but it's probably apocryphal, but it's a nice story. The point I'm trying to make here is the Congress enters this claim about representing India's diversity. And it's the kind of, what they're actually saying is that it's a kind of Noah's Ark nationalism. You know, if the Congress is a vessel, is a political vessel, the Congress is saying we have two of every kind of Indian human being on board. Now, it's one thing to say this, but it's quite another for anybody to take it seriously. So why is it taken seriously? It's taken seriously because luckily for the Congress, in the late 19th century, numbers don't matter. There are no elections. There's no real political mobilization of the idea of a majority or a minority. So if you look at the early history of Congress, Parsi leaders are just as important, if not more important, than Hindu or Muslim leaders. Think of Diksha Vaja and Firuzshah Mehta, and of course, above all, Dadabhai Naoroji. And this is because, not just in the eyes of the Congress, but also in the eyes of the colonial state, notables, important people stood in for their communities. That's how the Raj dealt with its human populations before it introduced the principle of elections reluctantly in 1909, well, earlier in the case of local self-government, but substantially at the provincial and imperial level in 1909. So, luckily for the Congress, what they're saying is sort of consonant with the way in which the Raj looks at India and the way in which the Raj looks to deal with India. The second part of Nehruvian pluralism, which is of course not Nehruvian, it's not even Nehru's father's, it's before even Motilal becomes an important figure in Congress politics. It's a quintessentially early Congress formulation. The second part of this, the first part is to claim that your party's diversity allows you to represent the nation. And this sort of works because this is how, in the political imaginary of both the Raj and the political elites of India, this is how you thought of representation. But the second crucial part is that, every nationalism, and in the case of Congress, it's not really nationalism, kind of weird pluralism, but every nationalism needs a grievance. It needs a complaint. It needs something that it is against or something that it is for. In the case of Italy, it would be they would rage against the Austrian Empire. In the case of Bismarck in Germany, they would rage against non-German political states and empires interfering with the integrity of Germany. In the case of India, if you wanted, someone could have claimed, and some nationalists did, different from Congress nationalists, but some nationalists, some of them were even within the Congress. You could have claimed that nationalism actually consists of a grievance, which is that we have been ruled for 1,000 years by aliens. So Muslims could be represented as kind of alien, oppressive community, and then the British could be joined to it, rather in the way in which the Sangh Parivar imagines the liberation of a Hindu nation. But the Congress didn't do this. It didn't do this because it made a calculation that in the face of a skeptical Raj, any attempt to find cultural or religious grievance or cultural or religious solidarity or homogeneity as a claim to reparation or nationalism would alienate another significant part of the Indian population. So how do you get around this? So at the end of the 19th century, by a kind of masterstroke, and it's impossible to know whether this is deliberate or not, but it's certainly something that becomes an integral part of Congress nationalism. You have, two major works. One is Naoroji's The Un-British Nature of British Rule in India. You have R.C. Dutt's Economic History of India. And what these two books do is they create an economic critique of the Raj. You're all familiar with terms like deindustrialization, the drain of wealth, the entire anti-colonial critique of the Raj as something that sucked the life and energy out of the economic life of India. Now, we need not be detained by whether these critiques were true or not. I mean, to this day, there's a lively debate about whether deindustrialization, drain of wealth actually stand up as historical explanations for the nature of the state of the Indian economy in the 19th and early 20th century. Morris David Morris, Dharma Kumar. There were many Indian historians and foreign historians who argued that the case is more mixed, that it's not necessarily the case that colonialism exploited India rapaciously, but that need not concern us right now. What is important for us is the strategic value of this critique. Because what this critique allows the Congress to do is that it allows the Congress to reinforce its pluralism by arguing that the colonial state damaged every section of Indian society. It damaged peasants because the revenue demand was so high. It damaged the working class and industrialists because factories were not protected through tariffs against foreign competition. It damaged the cause of the middle classes because the colonial state made sure that sitting for the ICS exams was made as difficult as possible. There's a whole series of critiques built into economic nationalism that allows the Congress to conveniently argue that all of India is made less by the colonial state, therefore all of India should be mobilized on a single platform. And by doing this, it allowed it to be nationalist without being exclusionary. So, in a way, economic nationalism allows the Congress a non-denominational way of being patriotic. You don't actually have to invoke the Marathas or invoke Hindu Padmashahi or indeed invoke any form of linguistic or cultural exclusiveness to make your claim to be an anti-colonial party speaking on behalf of all Indians. The point I'm trying to make here is that by the time Gandhi takes over the reins of the Congress 30 years after its founding, Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, he is working within an ideological frame that has been set by the first 30 years of Congress actions. Whether it's Gokhale, whether it's Tilak, and I'm simplifying hugely. There are arguments within the Congress. Lajpat Rai and Tilak represent a stream of political nationalism that is happier to use cultural symbols to mobilize people. Gokhale is someone who is more fastidious and scrupulous about this. Ranade, his mentor, falls somewhere between the two. But nonetheless, what we have by the time Gandhi comes to India is an intellectually fully fledged and completely eccentric nationalism. But it is a nationalism tailored for a subcontinent. I mean, what these people are trying to do, almost blithely, the ambition of it is staggering. You're actually trying to make the argument in a context of colonial subjugation that you speak for an entire subcontinent. And I mean an entire subcontinent. Partition has to happen. You're speaking for a country more diverse and as large as Europe without Russia. I mean, that is the scale of the ambition. It's a kind of three-card trick. It's partly bluff, it's partly belief. But the astonishing thing is that the Congress makes this plausible argument even before Gandhi comes in. Now, very quickly, between 1915 and 1947, because this is meant to be a talk about now instead of talk about then. Between 1915 and 1947, lots of things happen. Gandhi takes the Congress into mass mobilization, which strains this model. Because remember, this model was based essentially upon a world where mass politics didn't happen, where notables represented communities. And then suddenly you have Gandhi, who's doing Raga Satyagraha, non-cooperation. So you know the textbook movements, civil disobedience, the Quit India movement, apart from the general tone that he introduces within Indian politics, which is self-consciously non-elitist. And one of the people he alienates by doing this will return to be Congress's nemesis, will return to be the nemesis of this pluralist nationalism. One that he ironically used to represent, namely Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So what happens over these next 30 years is that in the Congress zoo, the Muslim enclosure seems to be less and less properly populated. It becomes obvious to the colonial state that there's a vulnerability here. It becomes obvious to Muslim leaders that the Congress doesn't seem to be in sync with what they would like to happen. And this is too large a subject to address in a lecture, but suffice it to say that in 1947, with partition, there's a near fatal blow to this idea of a pluralist nationalism. In the sense that this nationalism, for the larger part of its existence, was transactionally dedicated towards keeping Muslims on board. And when a substantial section of Muslims left with partition, the legitimacy of this program was thrown into considerable doubt. And you can see how this changes the nature of the republic. So, very simple ways. Before partition happens, the national language of India is meant to be Hindustani, written in both the Persian and the Nagari scripts. Immediately as partition happens, it becomes Hindi in the Nagari script. And there are various obvious and subterranean shifts that happen to, in a sense, reflect the changed reality of a partition. But the point I want to make is this: despite this, India doesn't go the way of other South Asian states, and I'll come to the other South Asian states in a moment. I think there are a few reasons for this. One is, of course, that what began as a stratagem, what began as a way of leveraging weakness into strength, this claim of representing diversity, had, in a sense, become a lived credo by the time 1947 happened. I think it's important for us not to be cynical, to accept that if you, in the heat of anti-colonial nationalism, try and live this credo for 20, 30 years, it does, in a sense, change your political DNA. And there is a sense in which, while Congress is an umbrella party with many people who we could probably see from hindsight would have been just as comfortable in the Hindu Mahasabha or the RSS as they were within the Congress. Nonetheless, as an organization, the Congress broadly remains true to its ideals, and its ideological pluralism lives on into the Republican state for several reasons. One, because the Congress has so much prestige, and Nehru has so much prestige as someone who actually fought and won a battle for liberation. Not in full measure, as he said, but substantially. Also, it's enormously important in the context of the slaughter raging around India between 47 and 50 to try and bring peace, to try and actually pacify this country. And in a sense, within the context of India, that ideological pluralism is seen as a kind of way of pouring oil into troubled waters. And you can see that, to a certain extent, this is happening on the other side of the border as well. Jinnah making an attempt to say that, look, partition has happened, and now let's go back to just being citizens. But most importantly, or very importantly, the reason why Congress stands by its principle of ideological pluralism is also because it's now a political party that has to win elections. And the BJP is constantly saying that Muslims are a vote bank of the Congress and so on. But it is true in 1947 that the Muslims, along with many other groups, were a substantial part of the electoral arithmetic of the Congress. It's one reason why Nehru was in power for 17 years, because the Congress, both as an anti-colonial party and as a pluralist party, had won their trust. I just want to quickly look at what happens post-47, not in the context of India alone. I think the problem with us as Indians, as students, as polemicists, as intellectuals, is that, like the residents of any large country, we tend to assume that we are unique. We tend to assume that we are exceptional. And there are some ways in which we are exceptional because of our size, but there are many ways in which they are not. And I think it's important that, given that South Asia was ruled by the same empire as we were, it's actually quite useful to see what happens to the other nations of South Asia so that we're in a position to set this pluralism that Nehru both represented and espoused in the context of the subcontinent. What happens in the subcontinent? And very quickly, if you look at what happens in 47, all the countries that become countries or nations at this point, whether Ceylon or Pakistan or India or indeed Burma a couple of years later. What is interesting about these countries? Benedict Anderson wrote this wonderful book called Imagined Communities. And Anderson's basic insight has been often vulgarized beyond recognition, but there is a certain basic truth to the blunt statement of it, which is to say that it's not as if a nation exists as an objective reality. That once colonial rule is thrown off, reveals its contours and becomes a self-governing agent. That a nation is also imagined, that a nation is a kind of subjective feeling that is built up over time through institutions, through public spheres, through print culture, etc. The thing about Anderson's thesis is that it's hard to actually make it work in a country, in a subcontinent like India, where the notion of print culture doesn't work very well with a substantially illiterate population, also a population under colonial rule. So we all had to imagine our nations. Our ancestors had to imagine our nations under the close surveillance of a colonial Raj, whose priorities were not ours. So our imagining was often cut short rudely, as it was with Mountbatten's decision to partition, before we had fully, achieved either the arrangements or, in fact, fully imagined what we wanted to be. And sometimes the result was partition. It happened to Pakistan, it happened to us, and it left behind this toxic afterlife, which still lives with us, this sort of radioactive feeling of resentment, which in a sense informed all of us. So let's quickly look at how did we do? How did all of us do with this? In the case of Pakistan, the attempt to preserve Jinnah's haptic to a non-sectarian state was tragically shown. Liaquat is killed, and essentially what you have is a predatory state created by a military that soon, by the time Zia comes around, begins to use faith as a way of achieving legitimacy in what is essentially a semi-feudal military autocracy. So the only political actors who have speaking roles in Pakistan for a long time now are essentially Sunni notables. So Pakistan is an early case of an entirely majoritarian state run by an authoritarian practice. But if you look at Sri Lanka is by far and away the best of South Asia's early democracies. Even if you go to Sri Lanka now, I remember going there when it was recovering from the aftermath of its gruesome civil war. And I think any of us who go there look at it and say, if you can put the civil war aside, which is a hard thing to do, but if you do put it aside in a kind of fit of absent-mindedness, you look at the place and you say, this is what we could have been if we had been grown up about our arrangements. Because there is a sense in which Sri Lanka it doesn't really compare with India in scale, but it is in many ways a remarkable middle-income society, and it's a South Asian society. But unfortunately, what we find is that this wonderful hyperliterate state in 1956 chooses majoritarianism. Quickly, what is majoritarianism? Majoritarianism is the belief that the political destiny of a country should be determined by its ethnic or religious majority. So in 1956, Solomon Bandaranaike passes the Sinhala Only Act, which basically says that the language of government in Sri Lanka will only be Sinhala, which essentially cuts off the Tamil middle class from access to the state. They don't even make any provision for using Tamil in Tamil areas. This is followed by pogroms in 1958, where Tamils are killed. And this, of course, leads to the unending cycle of civil war, secessionism, and still more civil war. In 1971, Ceylon changes its name to Sri Lanka. and it gives Buddhism the foremost place in the life of the state. And one of the things that we have learned from the example of South Asia is that second-class citizenship is an unstable thing. It inevitably leads to violence and war within a state, because it essentially means that you're not really a citizen, or you're a citizen at the pleasure of the majority that are the organic citizens of that state. So, in the case of Sri Lanka, on the face of it, this literate middle-income state, it achieves a great deal, but it's completely destroyed. It uses like 30 years of development on account of this monstrous civil war. In the case of Bangladesh, in 71, they throw off a kind of non-Bengali hegemony with the aid of the Indian army, and Mujib's Awami League is for a while a conspicuously secular party. Its national anthem is written by Tagore. It formally declares itself a secular state, but we see that this is not a universal view. The BNP, which is the other major party, is in some ways a kind of military Islamist party, rather like its Pakistani counterparts. So what we've seen in Bangladesh is a kind of fluctuating commitment to even-handedness. So paradoxically, Islam is both the state religion of Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is also a second state. You have this peculiar attempt to sort of square a circle. And one of the things that we do know about Bangladesh is that its non-Muslim Hindu population has been in secular decline ever since it was East Pakistan, but certainly even after it became Bangladesh. So, in the case of Burma, which till 1937 was a part of British India, ironically, as Burma moved towards democracy, or kind of quasi-democracy in the second decade of the century, this move towards democracy made the essential majoritarianism of the Buddhist majority, the Bamar people, and the Sangha, it accentuated even more. We've seen how Aung San Suu Kyi, from being a kind of global icon, became essentially represented as a kind of bloodthirsty majoritarian. For the longest time, Indian intellectuals have always resisted any attempt to us being clubbed with these states. And the argument has been that to assimilate India into the ranks of these smelly states that so enthusiastically embrace a state faith and so enthusiastically participated in the persecution of its minorities is to misrepresent India. India is not like that. Well, as we have learned since the ascension of the BJP, that present-day circumstances force us as historians and as citizens to look back upon our history and wonder how we got here. What were the roots? What were the channels that actually fed this majoritarianism? Because it would not have come from nothing. And it leads us to ask the question. We could ask this question in two ways. We could ask, why did we succumb to majoritarianism? Or we could ask it the other way. We could ask, why did it take us so long? Because if we are making the case, and we mentioned this yesterday, I think Akar mentioned this, that, if we are making the case that what contemporary history has shown us is there are votes in bigotry. That you can actually produce a block of voters through targeted discrimination, along with other things. I mean, in the case of present political establishment, what we've seen is an enormous pervasive intelligence in both targeting welfare and targeting, if you will, discrimination. And the two together create a kind of block of voters in the context of a modern media environment that allows you to win elections. So the question is, if this is the case, was this inevitable? I mean, is this a kind of formula that in a sense is irresistible? It's useful to look at the Indian instance in this context. When does this begin to happen to us? For a moment, let's not deal in nuance. We can obviously find from the 40s onwards, the 50s onwards, examples of majoritarian thinking. After all, we had Chansan, we had various forms of communalized politics. I would actually say that if you're going to put a date to it, 83 and 84 would occur. 83 is the massacre in Delhi in Assam. 84 is the pogrom in both our pogroms, the pogrom in Delhi of 6 after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And I think the reason they are significant is that one happens on the marches of India, one happens on the borders, in the borderland of India. And it happens because of this enormously powerful and compelling allegation of infiltration. The idea that organic people are being eroded by external enemies. And remember, what happens in Delhi, in a way, precisely maps out onto what happens with the Rohingya in Burma, in Myanmar. Because essentially you have a group of Bengali-speaking people, the Rohingya speak a language at least cognate to Bengali, who've lived at least since colonial times, if not longer, in the Rakhine province, and they're never given citizenship from the moment of Myanmar's liberation. They're periodically given voting rights on an ad hoc basis. And then essentially what happens is, in the situation of second-class citizenship, when it comes to instating some form of democracy, they are denied voter rights, they are corralled into camps, so they are no longer living in ordinary villages, and then the Rohingya, in an act of criminal foolishness, attempt to attack a police outpost, and then there's this massive ethnic cleansing retribution, a form of genocide. Essentially, the Rohingya are flushed out of Burma. I think I want you to remember this because it's important for us to understand the consequences of bigotry. You know, it happened in Myanmar. You know, an entire people was, in a sense, purged. An entire people was reduced by genocidal violence to its knees in the Sri Lankan Civil War. So we should be careful. You know, this could happen here, if here broadly is something that we mean by South Asia. So in 83, you have violence in Delhi, a pogrom in Delhi. In 84, you have in Delhi. Delhi's significance, of course, is that the grand old party of India, the party of Nehru, supervises a pogrom after the death of one of its political leaders. Over 3 or 4 days, not in some border province like Delhi, but in the capital of the state. And the other lesson that is learned through 83 and 84, and the reason why I would see this kind of inflection point in India succumbing to the majoritarian virus, is that both the Congress and the AASU, that in a sense participate in this program, win elections on the back of it. You know, I lived through Delhi when a very slick advertising agency called Rediffusion did the election campaign in English language newspapers for the Congress. And they had these clever graphics with messages like, does your taxi driver scare you? Remember, the taxi drivers in North India very often say, does your taxi driver scare you? Vote Congress. The Congress began to use in its Hindi advertisements little jingles like this. Chunauti nahi, ek sandesh, mazboot hai haath, akhand hai desh. This is interesting because akhand was a term that the Congress never used because it was exclusively the property of the Sangh Parivar, as in Akhand Bharat. So 83 to 84 is this point of inflection, where essentially what you see is majoritarian politicians are paying close attention to what happens and they learn important lessons. And the lesson they learn is that profound pogrom-like violence can yield electoral victories. It's a lesson that is internalized and learned. Essentially, the question now is, why does Congress pluralism, in a sense, fail completely and conclusively at this point in time? Or why does it succumb to a movement led by the BJP? I'll take 5 minutes to just round this up. I'm sorry, I'll take too long. I think the reason it does is there's a very good book by someone called Ashoka Modi, who's an economist. It's called India is Broken. And he makes the argument that essentially what you have in 1947 is a form of government policy that emphasizes economic autarky, self-reliance, non-alignment, and secularism. The most pressing task in front of the Indian state in 1947 is to create jobs for the underemployed people in its stagnant agriculture. And the way to do it, according to Modi, was to do what the other Asian countries had done, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or even China, which is to create simple industries that would allow simple rural folk who are not necessarily particularly well educated to find employment here, and thus create employment, and thus gradually create a buoyant economy. This would also need universal primary education to improve the quality of the workforce of India. And these are two things that Nehru doesn't do. What Nehru does instead is that he invests in higher education. We spoke of the IITs, the IIMs, and so on, the National Physical Laboratory, the National Chemical Laboratory. And these are all extraordinary achievements, but they are nonetheless ornaments on top of Christmas tree. You know, they don't actually educate the people whom you want to make productive members of the economy. So what happens is that when the Indian economy hits the buffers in the late 1950s and 60s, and goes through this really bad phase, which leaks into the 1970s, one of the reasons why the emergency happens is because Mr. Gandhi and the Congress are unable to control this, that the promise of independence, the economic promise of independence, has in a sense been frittered away. So Modi's argument is that the Congress agenda, which consists of this triumvirate of things, the central part of it, the material part of it, which is the promise of employment and some level of not prosperity, at least some level of livelihood, has exhausted itself by 1980. And that what you actually need is a reimagining of the promise of the state. And tragically, this reimagining is done by the BJP. If you look at the 1980s, it is true when our Prime Minister talks about a new nationalism. He's right. This is a new nationalism. It's a new nationalism based upon the classic orthodoxies of European nationalism. The representation of a homogeneous group, the exclusion of people who are seen as peripheral to that group, the organization of a nationalism that seeks to argue that prosperity lies both through good economic policy and also through the hunting out of Trojan horses and aliens who are preventing India from achieving its potential. So we see in the 1980s that with the first national network in television, with the release of the great Hindu epics, this is not a conspiracy, but what essentially happens is that the Ranjan Bhumi movement happens at this moment of dissolution and is in a masterful way piloted by Advani and Vajpayee and others into a new kind of nationalist promise, a promise that is eventually redeemed by Narendra Modi. Again, with the active complicity of the Congress, because remember, the pogrom violence after the raising of the Babri Masjid and in Godhra in 2002, in a sense, benchmarks what's happened before in 83 and 84. And the Congress is, in a sense, being complicit in this. So there is a sense in which Akav pointed to this yesterday. He said that, I don't believe in kind of great man theory of history, but we do need someone or some group or some ginger group to, in a sense, be able to imagine a redemptive promise, a progressive redemptive promise, better than the grand old party has been able to. And there have been various attempts to, you can see that in Delhi, the Aam Aadmi Party attempts a kind of anti-corruption program to promise a new kind of India. But it's obviously a large task. And the final question, the final point that I want to make before I end is this. If we were to assume that 3 terms of Narendra Modi represent the final conclusive defeat, or might represent the final conclusive defeat of this pluralism, this ideological pluralism that the Nehruvian state both embodied and tried in its own way to practice. What is the historical significance of this experience? In the end, if it was defeated, were the energies invested in it for nothing. And certainly it would be an enormous defeat if this was the case. But I just want to make the point that um, it's important to think about it in this way. The reason this experience was important, regardless of what happens from now on, is that when a subcontinental-sized republic, for at least 40 years, a systematic attempt was made to incorporate the recognition of difference and diversity into not just the policies, but into the constitutional fibers of a nation state. If you look at the European example, if you look at, for example, France with its notion of secularism, which is essentially laicite. Laicite basically means that you rigorously exclude all faith from the public sphere. But what we've seen in France is that Marine Le Pen is one of the greatest advocates of laicite, because the rigorous ignoring of difference also means, what the French did was they essentially abolished their Catholic Church and its propriety. But that didn't make them secular or pluralist in our understanding. What they then said is, okay, we've done it. We Christian Catholics have done it. Now we expect all you Jews to forget about your fussy Judaism and just become French people. And of course, to be French means to by default be like the majority. So I think one of the most interesting things that the Indian state did, both in terms of affirmative action, where, unlike America or unlike France, which have decided that it would be wiser not to institutionalize affirmative action, India did, for better or for worse. It actually created a precedent for how we deal with inequality. This list of holidays that all universities and colleges have, 2 or 3 from every conceivable faith practice that so many of us have laughed at. But it is a kind of performative way of recognizing difference. And if the Indian Republic did nothing else, it tried for a while to institutionally live the ideal of trying to achieve welfare and equity while at the same time recognizing that one size did not fit all, that a subcontinent could not be remade according to the prescriptions of some convenient state. So I just want to end with just a quote from a young Naga academic called G. Kanato Chofi. I think it doesn't get any lessons from, but I think the useful thing to remember. He says, I belong to an emerging class of educated Nagas who consider themselves constitutional Indians. Many of the young in my community are culturally conservative, proud of their region's distinctive history, language, and ethnic identity. But at the same time, seeking common ground with fellow citizens in other regions who have their own, sometimes incomprehensibly different language, history, and culture. For a Naga, this common ground is the idea of a modern and secular India, as the Ambedkar-inspired constitution defines it, not the largely elite and Brahmanical nation of a timeless Indian civilization. The umbilical cord connecting Nagas with mainland India is not the cord of a shared ancient history or culture. The link is tenuous and has to do with the idea of equality, justice, and liberty enshrined in the Indian constitution. I think there's a sense in which Chofi speaks not just for minorities on India's borderlands, but speaks for both groups and individuals in India everywhere. The idea that in the ability to recognize difference in a systematic principle and constitutional way lies enormous value. And that some of this value has already been generated and stored for posterity by this flawed experiment that we call Nehruvian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mukul for such an enlightening and insightful session. I also thank Professor Shri Hare Krishna for moderating this session. I invite Mr. Brandon Emma, Assistant Professor.
Thank you, Doctor. My only request to the audience is that make good use of his presence. You don't get him often in Kerala. So, to use a theoretical cliche, you should tease the metaphors out of lethargy and bring out the best from him. So, ask him questions. He dabbles in plenty of areas, so don't just limit your questions to this topic alone. History, columnist, and wonderful thing is that he dabbles in cricket also. And I'll ask him that later, but I was fascinated. Why are historians dabbling in cricket? You take your time to answer. So, dear friends, please be free to ask questions. Don't wait for your best question. Ask, and sometimes his replies would bring out the best in your questions too. So please. Hello.
Good morning, sir. I feel very honored to ask you. While I read about you, I came to know about your father, P.S. Kesavan, the first National Librarian of Independent India, Curator of Imperial Library, Alipu, Calcutta. So he was born in a pre-independence era. For me, history, independence struggle were only textbook knowledge. So he had experienced the transition of India from colonialism to independence. So did he share his experiences and insights about that transition to you during your childhood? And especially in one article I read about that in 1936, he went to University of London to pursue his master's, I think so, and he did his bachelor's from the University of Mysore, Maharaja College, I think so. So did he share his experiences of his education during the British Raj time?
Thank you for that question. I'm always happy to talk about my family. First of all, just my name, Kesavan. In my life in Delhi, I've sometimes been mistaken for someone from Kerala because Kesavan is. But I'm actually a North Indian. And my mother is from North India, and my father was from Karnataka, but I grew up in Delhi. I'm illiterate in every South Indian language. I'm ashamed to say this, but it's true. About my father's experience of partition, yes, we spoke about this all the time. I mean, he remembered tragically the fact that in 1947, many of his Muslim colleagues in the Ministry of Education actually took shelter in the old fort, which was a kind of refuge for Muslims threatened with violence in Delhi. In fact, when I wrote the one novel I did, there's a sort of climactic scene which is set in the old fort, which is based almost entirely on my father's memories. I'm also frequently confronted with a photograph of my father's, which is used often as an emblem of partition, weirdly enough, because there's a photograph first published in Time magazine in 1949, where my father is sitting at a desk with heaps of books on either side of him, and there's a big board on one set of books which says India, and another board on another set of books which says Pakistan, seemingly presiding over the partition of libraries. So I remember asking him this when it was published in 1997, when it was republished in 1997, this photograph. And he said this partition didn't take place. Mercifully, the libraries were left undivided. And he had disappointingly no memory at all of this photograph, which he claimed
was Photoshop, but it couldn't be the case because there was no Photoshop in 1949 when it was first published. So yes, we all lived through our parents, and we all lived through their lives. About this thing about him studying abroad, in the context that we were talking about right now, he went to England to be a student in 1929, and then in 1931-32, because he was doing a master's in London, one of the requirements was that you had to do a classical language and you had to do a modern European language. So with the classical language, he cheated. He said that he chose Sanskrit, which he knew already. The modern European language he had to go and learn. So he went off to Germany, where the idea was you'd be put in a German household and you'd be immersed in the language so that you would learn it. So he spent 9 months in Germany. So I said, you were in Germany in 1932. He was in Jena, which is sort of Eastern Germany, so Juncker territory, the heartland of Nazism in a sense. I said, so what was it like? And he had no memory of it. He said, I was an Indian student trying to learn German. I was completely insular. And I think the lesson of that story is that great momentous and horrific events can happen around you without you paying attention. So we need to pay attention. I mean, my father would be enormously flattered to hear that, but no, I mean, I think Borges is quite sick.
Hello, sir. So my question, I have two questions. My first one is on the idea of reparations. We hear that word a lot, right? Of colonial reparations, caste oppression-based reparations, race-based reparations. So do you think how practical do you think the idea of reparations is? And do you think there should be a statute of limitations to it?
Do you mean this in any specific context? In the context of
Indian post-colonial context.
Okay. When I'm uncertain about this, when the Vajpayee government was in power, which was the first time that the Bharatiya Janata Party had been party in 1999-2000. I asked, like many people, I was concerned about this, and I thought. I wrote a pamphlet called Secular Common Sense, where when I read that pamphlet, I can actually see myself trying to be reasonable, because the conceit behind that pamphlet is that if I was having an argument in a public square with someone who was not sympathetic to my ideological position, what could I reasonably say to him that might help him change his mind? So throughout that short book or pamphlet, I'm constantly trying to second guess and to restrain what I think of as positions that someone else might find extreme. And I remember, at one point, addressing a kind of question vaguely related to what you're saying, which is Neera Chandok, a scholar, had written a book where which was I think called Beyond Minorities, where she said that in a properly secular state, the state would constantly affirmatively recognize minority rights in the cultural and educational sphere, and actively reach out to produce affirmative actions for minorities. And I remember writing in Secular Common Sense that this is a terrible idea, because can you imagine what would happen if a Muslim writer in Hindi from UP was given a fellowship that was not available to a Hindu writer in Hindi, given the fact that UP, regardless of whether you're Hindu or Muslim, you're likely to be not particularly comfortably off. This performative, this performance of affirmative action might make the situation worse rather than better, because it might cause just enormous sort of resentment. But I can see that every time you look at affirmative action of any kind, or reparation in this case, you always have to account for what people for whom reparations are not available will think of this. Will they see it as a kind of zero-sum game? You know, many economists, Amartya Sen, for example, argues that unless welfare is universal, it will be destroyed by the middle class. So, take the example of ration shops in India. There was a time when middle class people happily bought sugar and this, that, and the other from their ration shops. And then at some point, people decided that this would be targeted, that you would not be eligible for it if you were above. And essentially, what the middle class then does is it closes down all those ration shops, because anything it cannot benefit from, it will not allow to survive. I think one tentative response to your question would be that reparations, what would reparations in India look like? Essentially, the least controversial form of reparation would be reparations for, say, what in the colonial period used to be called the depressed classes, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. There is a sense in which there's a form of reparation in reservation and affirmative action. And I think that's the point I was trying to make towards the end of my talk, which is that the value of the Indian state, the Indian Republic, is that it actually went there. It actually did say that we will do reservations, that this will be constitutionally embedded in our founding document. That this would not be American university style affirmative action where you sort of, twiddle the needle, you put your finger on the scales when you thought it was appropriate, but it would be mandated. And I've lived my life in India, in the universities, and I can tell you that these, if we call them reparations or if you call them affirmative actions, these were hugely resisted by often well-meaning people as something that would lower the standards of the. But in the end, they happened. You actually did have an institution transformed to a certain extent by affirmative action, which was a form of reparation for what happened in the past. So I think the Indian state has done this. Whether you're talking about more dramatic reparations of the kind that, for example, have been mooted in certain circumstances in the West, I haven't thought about that enough to say.
May I ask one more question? So my second question is about how, when you look at the diaspora, we have seen a general trend towards conservatism and right-wing throughout the world. But when you look at Indian diaspora specifically, you can see more of a right-wing leaning there. For example, organizations like the Overseas Friend of the RSS, etc. So why is it that the diaspora, Indian diaspora specifically, is leaning towards the right than central or left?
I'm not sure I can produce a comprehensive answer to that. I can produce the simple one, which is that India exported its Savarn population. I mean, it's quite simple. My brother lives in DC, as do many other people's siblings. And it exported that section of that population, which for a while, for example, if you're going to talk about conservative in the context of, say, the United States of America, for a long while, that diaspora voted reliably Democratic because there was a price to entrance, and they felt the price to entrance might be lowered by a liberal, relatively liberal political party that was in some general way willing to genuflect in the direction of diversity. But increasingly, this diaspora in America votes Republican simply because the barrier to entry has been crossed. There's an entrenched, affluent. I mean, Indian Americans are, on an average, the highest earners in the US. Generally speaking, if you follow the money, you follow the political direction. So I imagine that's the reason why. I would also say, though, that there are parts of the diaspora which are not necessarily. So if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, large parts of the United Kingdom, especially northern England, were populated by people who came from the subcontinent, who were plebeian, who were working class. The Mirpuris, for example, from occupied Kashmir, or indeed many of the Sikhs and the Punjab diaspora, many of them are not necessarily affirmatively right-wing. So I think it's a function of who goes.
Namaste, Salam sir. I'm Shaheen. Sir, you had mentioned about Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities, and that was with respect to the Europe. He published this book in 1983. And before that, Ambedkar had written about how the Muslims in India is a nation within themselves. And, and when it comes to the South Asian society, as well as in Russia, I think there was this sort of imagination of certain communities within themselves. For example, the Brahminists had a history of their own, there's common history and common heritage, and there's Dravidians imagine a history and common heritage of their own. And Ambedkar talked about India, and this happened in the Soviet Union also, which eventually contributed to its dissolution. So, how do you look at that perspective, to the South Asian as well as its, diverse communities? Is it a post-colonial phenomena contributing? I hope I made it.
If I understand your question right, what you're saying is that there have been autonomous acts of imagining, whereby groups within continental populations like Russia's or India's imagine their myths of origin in different ways, and therefore imagine their social and political orientation in the present in different ways. And I think you said that you felt that perhaps this insufficiently that the lack of a single imaginary that could include all of Russia in its diversity, the Soviet Union in its diversity, or all of India in its diversity. The absence of this, so the weakness of this, is the reason why political states like the USSR fell apart. Is that the question? That
yes.
Yeah. So I think what happens is to quote, say, Robert Frost, you come to a fork and you take a road, and then there's the road not taken. But the road not taken doesn't actually disappear, in the sense that the road is forked and you've gone one way, but the other fork becomes subterranean. It can be a spectral presence in your mind. So, for example, the Khalistan movement is a form of nationalist imagination, and it's thinking about. It's almost as if it's thinking about 1947 and thinking that what happened to a Sikh state. The Hindus got theirs, the Muslims got theirs, and so the road you choose does suppress certain possibilities, but it doesn't necessarily suppress them completely, and sometimes they mutate, into other things. I was just speaking with Akar yesterday, and I was talking about the fact that there is a kind of fictional possibility that occurs with the Cabinet Mission Plan in 1945-46, which is the idea that you're going to have undivided India grouped into 3 provinces. And at the end of 10 years, the constituent members of each province will decide whether they want to stay in India or whether they want to go. But for 10 years, India will be unified with a weak center, which will deal with currency and foreign affairs, but not with very much else. And sometimes you think that maybe there was a possibility where India wasn't a unitary state, but where India was a confederate state, which would, in a sense, make it approximate some way to, say, Europe, which currently is under a form of slightly confused confederalism, under the European Union. So I think there are prospects that open up and prospects that close, but because none of them are closed forever, they frequently, bubble up as conflict, as resentment. So it's not given that the Indian nation state is necessarily, because of disagreements within the way in which people imagine themselves, is necessarily doomed to break up in the way in which the Soviet Union did. Modern states don't break up. it's very difficult to break them up. Extremely powerful states. It's very difficult to actually disaggregate the state once it's made, unless it's in conditions of profound economic conflict or war. So I think we are stuck with the boundaries we have, and increasingly the point is, how do you work within them?
Yes, I was also referring to the regional nationalism who have that has their own cultural heritage, common history, and everything with respect to.
You can see micronationalisms play out, if that's the what term you want to use, in Manipur. In Manipur, you have a situation where you have a small state, and you have a new kind of majoritarian politics that is emerging there, where there's a kind of provincial and center alliance, a kind of agreement about who are the organic citizens of the state and who are the outsiders. And of course, that can happen. And I think because it can happen, and because nation states are so strong, that we should recognize that insensate violence can happen here. You saw this happen in Burma. You saw 1 million people ethnically cleansed, and they all sit in Cox's Bazars in Bangladesh. You saw just genocidal violence in the case of Sri Lanka. So states are both strong and capable of astonishing violence. And what is interesting is that if you look at what happened in Gaza, you can have a formally democratic state, Israel, formally democratic in the sense that I'm not talking about the occupied territories, within itself it's a majoritarian state. But it is nominally democratic as far as the Jewish population is concerned. But you can have a situation where if its geopolitical stars align, if its horoscope works, it can be actually given a license to kill, which results in what's happened in Palestine and Gaza at this time. So we frequently look at the histories of other people as if they were remote spectacle. But many of these violent spectacles have happened very close to home. And I think, given these two facts, that nation states are almost invincibly strong, and that precedents exist for insensate cleansing violence, the need to constantly think about how we can ameliorate our circumstances is really important.
We have a question from our online entity. So the question is, these days, the biggest allegation against Congress is its appeasement of the Muslims for vote bank politics, which is widely believed also. So Congress is in real dilemma, if not a trap. What do you think is the way out of this for Congress to remain pluralistic and defend itself against BJP? Online. Thomas.
One of the wonderful thing about Indian political discourse is the terms that we've invented for ourselves to describe the way in which this politics happens. And one of the most fascinating terms is the notion of a vote bank. It's useful to see how this works, because you can use vote bank sort of neutrally. You can use it to describe the way in which parties in, say, a particular constituency try and appeal to different sections of society to create a plurality of votes that they can win with. But most often, vote bank is generally associated with pandering to a minority. It doesn't have to be Muslims, it can be Christians, it can be Dalits, it can be anybody you want. And the implication of this is that the nominal majority, I say nominal because not all majorities are politically mobilized or aware of themselves. So if one was, I think implicit in this question is this idea that there are people who are not vote banks, that there are people who vote, that they have agency. They vote because they have preferences. They vote on the merits of a candidate. On the other hand, you have a collectivity that does not vote on the merits of the case, that votes merely because it seeks favor or protection. And what we're doing essentially when we use this insidious language is that we take away agency from, say, in this case, a Muslim, and we give it instead to someone who is not a Muslim. So not a Muslim, if you put hyphens in it, not a Muslim. A not a Muslim is a rational citizen who votes because he thinks about what he's voting for. But a Muslim is someone who essentially responds to a kind of Pavlovian stimulus. And the reason why this is such a pernicious idea is that if you actually look at patterns of Muslim voting in India, historically, since 1947, number one, outside of Kerala, there hasn't been a pan-Indian explicitly Muslim party. That Muslims have seldom in India had the choice of actually voting for a party that explicitly seeks to represent them and only them. Two, I mean, this notion of, if you look at the way in which Muslim votes in, say, India's largest state, which is UP, are distributed, you can see there's a whole plethora of parties that these votes go to. In Vajpayee's Lucknow, when he stood for, the Shia vote used to go to Vajpayee, simply because of intra-communal dispute. It's gone to Mayawati's party, the Muslim votes have gone to the Samajwadi party, to the Congress party. So the idea that Muslims are a vote bank is not a political observation. The idea that Muslims are a vote bank is a way of saying that Muslims are dangerous sheep who people pander to and thus sacrifice the interest of the nation. It's just a loaded question. It's a question that we should all refuse to answer.
So thank you for the encouraging delivery of your topic. Especially I liked your terms like Noah's Ark nationalism and the promise of redemptive reimagination that is needed today. So thank you for taking throughout the history of Congress from its formation to exhaustion and the emergence of Hindutva today. What I want to point out is that from the original Congress, before Motilal Nehru came, you told it represented diversity. And of course, then comes the Nehruvian Congress. And what I feel is the criticism that is against Nehru today, during Nehru or after Nehru till now, Congress became dynastic and family oriented. And again, we see the emergency and Sikh massacre, 1975, 1994. And yesterday, Akash sir also said Nehru was Eurocentric. And we see there is a lack of Bharatiyata, Indianness. Yes, Bharatiyata, Indianness in Nehru. What I would say, he was trying to create the citizen. And he recognized Muslims or other diversities. But my question is, did Congress and Nehru really aware of all the diversities and pluralities of India? Or if not, will in the new imagination, will we be able to do that? Because in Indian constitution recognizes 22 languages, we have more languages. And what Nehru negated, the caste, OBCs, even tribals, everybody coming with more new regional parties. India got, even Shashi Tharoor said, new many time zones, but only the time in Delhi is considered the time everywhere in a large subcontinent like this. So we have many time zones, many languages, many ethnicities. And we need, you said, we need a better reimagination than the first Congress did. So how are we going to include not only the religious diversities, But all diversities, ethnicities, geographical variations, such a vast India, how are we going to recognize all diversities in our new imagination of our country?
First of all, I think you make a very important point about dynasticism, because we could argue that the premature death of Lal Bahadur Shastri led to the instatement of a dynasty, but Nehru was complicit in this, in the sense that he made Mrs. Gandhi a minister in his cabinet and took her counsel. So that's a very important point, that Nehru is complicit in dynasty, which does a great deal to destroy the political credibility of the Congress. About your about your question about reimagining India to take account of its sort of infinite diversity, I'd just like to say this, that one of the good and robust things about Nehru's generation was, as you know, that Nehru wasn't in favor of linguistic states, because he felt that linguistic exclusion was no better than religious exclusion, and he had to, in a sense, learn that he was wrong. After the suicide in the Andhra region, and then he accepted the fact that that linguistic states were, in fact, India's future. I think it's interesting, I would generally say, in answer to your question, that there is not always a solution to every problem. There isn't always a niche for every diversity. I think what the Congress at its best did was that it sometimes recognized that there was no solution to the problem of Hindi as the pan-Indian official language and all the other languages as national languages. And it's not as if the Congress is even trying to find a solution. What it's trying to do is postpone the solution. It's trying to allow a hot button issue to grow cold. So you have linguistic states and you sort of have Hindi. So Mr. Modi will constantly go on about how all Malayalis should learn Hindi and speak in Hindi because it's a national language as Malayalam. But I think what the Congress and Nehru had the pragmatism to realize is you can't fix everything. What you can do is not allow the best to be the enemy of the good. So I don't think there'll ever be a situation where we will reimagine this bizarrely diverse subcontinent in a way where there is one khana for every diversity. It's not going to happen. We have to find common causes that unite us, whether it's economic rationality or whether it is a concern for the least privileged, and try and achieve sort of compromise solutions to this. Because there is a form of performative political correctness which is madness. There's a point where you then allow the right wing to caricature you as the person who is a one-legged, sandal-wearing, intersex vegetarian. You can't allow a situation where your commitment to diversity makes you a kind of laughing stock in terms of practical politics. I think what you have to do is acknowledge diversity, as the Indian state has done beyond virtually any other state that I can think of, and then try and find workarounds and compromises that allow you to both make policy without being, in a sense, paralyzed by your need to find a slot for everyone. Because I don't think it's the nature of politics for this to actually be possible. So we shouldn't set ourselves the impossible. We should seek our redemption within a pluralism that has some element of pragmatic policy.
Right.
How did the Mandal movement, instead of strengthening Nehru's ideological pluralism, weakened it, and actually the right wing BJP reaped the benefit of Mandal movement?
I think I remember the Mandal agitation vividly. I was a university teacher by that time, and the Mandal Commission genuinely challenged, India's ruling middle class and forced it to examine its intellectual priors. Because, I think there was, while many people resented affirmative action and reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, I think there was a consensual recognition that their historical exclusion had been so extreme that it was appropriate to institutionalize affirmative action. I don't think that consensus existed as far as the notion of the OBC was concerned, partly because, as it always happens in India, the Mandal Commission delivers its report, nobody does anything about it. Then the politics of the situation outruns the political consensus. You have violence, both genuinely felt and performative, and then the political world tries to pick the bones of this, of this argument, and seeks to make its peace with this new circumstance. And Indian universities were offered large sums of money, were given large sums of money to try and expand their intake to make room for the Mandal reservations. I think I don't think the question is who benefited. I think that's the wrong question. Whether the Congress benefited or the BJP benefited. I mean, that's a question of how every party plays the game of political arithmetic. I think the question rather is that, and in the abstract, the question is that did you because in a sense, what happens with Mandal in the north has already happened in, say, Tamil Nadu. So reservations within Tamil Nadu have already transcended the constitutional guarantee of reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes when this actually happens. So the larger question is that the opponents of reservations have always argued that if you create precedents and reserve above a certain level, you have a dysfunctional system in which people feel shut out. The people here, of course, are generally the Savarna, who are the people who are not reserved for. But now, in fact, you have reservation for the Savarna as well, which is the creamy, the economically weaker sections, which is essentially directed at those members of Savarna. So I think the question is, at what point does the slicing of an administrative or political cake become a solution to the kinds of competing demands that you're addressing? And I think that's a question that's going to be alive for a long time, because I don't see any political party actually drawing a line in the sand and making a substantial disagreement for it. I mean, many political parties did when the Mandal agitation began, but once the legislation was passed, I don't see anybody bucking this consensus.
Actually, this is connected to the dynastic politics that the Congress is involved in. His question. So what I thought, the genocide in Burma and what happened in Sri Lanka, can you say that, and you said that something similar happened in Delhi, in the Sikh genocide, wasn't that more of a family affair than majoritarian movement? Wasn't it a fallout of Indra is India and India is Indra thing? Wouldn't suppose, instead of the Sikhs, if the Tamils were there who did this to Indra, wouldn't Rajiv had said it at that point of time that jab koi bada ped girta hai, to bhukam to hona hi tha.
First of all, I wouldn't actually say that 1984 was a genocide, it was a pogrom, as was Nelly. Was it a dynastic affair? I think it's certainly true that Mrs. Gandhi was deeply implicated in the Khalistan movement of the twisted turns that it took, that she was the prime minister that ordered Blue Star, and there was a special, there's very specific animus directly towards her. But Khalistan is not an Indira Gandhi project. Khalistan is the result of a Punjab that comes off a certain kind of agricultural high, and where increasingly the competition for control over Punjab politics brings in the center. Mrs. Gandhi patronizes Bhindranwale as a way of breaking the Akali stranglehold on Punjab. So she certainly was implicated in this in a very big way. But I don't think her assassins were interested in whether she was the daughter of Nehru or not. She was a symbol. She was symbolic of the Indian state, and coming as it had on the heels of a secessionist movement, which particularly in Delhi had a certain had a certain political impact. I remember as a young man traveling through sandbag crossings, people with guns. So it was, Khalistan was in the air, and her assassination wouldn't have been a pogrom if it hadn't been orchestrated by the Congress. I mean, this was, pogroms invariably are orchestrated by the state, either through inattention or active participation. I can testify to the fact, that over 4 days, we went to Tirupuri and Kalyanpuri, and there were policemen standing by who had stood by while this happened. So I wouldn't say that. I don't think it was a dynastic. I mean, if your question is, why is it that when Rajiv Gandhi is blown up, why isn't there a pogrom against Tamils? Is that the question? No.
My question is, you said that what happened in Sri Lanka or what happened in Burma, can you say that the same thing happened? You said that it's about majoritarianism. That's not what I believe. Like, it's happened because the Congress was there. You're right. It is the Congress dynastic politics that contributed to the brutal massacre of the Sikhs. It's nothing to do with the majority community, is what it's saying.
I can answer that question. All pogroms have state agents, and you're right that the state will use its power. That there's no reason to necessarily believe that the population or the majoritarian population is complicit in this. I would just ask you, though, to pay attention to the fact that on the back of this pogrom, Rajiv Gandhi won something like a 4/5 majority in Parliament. There are people who voted for the Congress precisely because the Congress had responded with strength. There are people who wanted to punish Sikhs. And that is a majoritarian sentiment. I think it would be trivializing what happened in 1984 to suggest that this was family wickedness that caused it. Because what happened afterwards was a concerted endorsement of this. In the same way, after the Delhi massacre, the leadership of the Ashram came back as the ruling party in Assam. I think that's the important thing. The reason why 83 and 84 are an inflection point in India's history with majoritarianism is because they teach the lesson that concerted violence is electorally profitable. Because it creates, whether temporarily or permanently, majoritarian blocks that can propel you into office.
Again, a question from PJ Thomas, SP College. So he agrees totally that the Muslims have agency like any other, but I was referring to the stereotype widely used. Again, the idea of pluralistic nationalism in our context mainly refers to the Muslim question, and this is always associated with Congress too, but this is heavily used against Congress nationally and even in Kerala now. It is a comparatively enlightened state, so this Muslim question has become really a sticky issue for Congress. A recent example is the Waqf issue in Kerala. So, what do you think how the Congress can deal with it in a way it can survive with its pluralistic ideology and come to power someday peacefully?
That's a good rephrasing of the question. It is the case that the Congress will, or indeed any party that gets a substantial section of the Muslim vote, will be accused by majoritarian parties in India of pandering to Muslims. And we know that this allegation often yields political and electoral dividends, and that political parties who have a Muslim constituency therefore feel defensive about whether their electoral connection with Muslims is costing them votes elsewhere. I mean, this is true. This is something that all political parties have to navigate. I'll give you an example from Delhi. In the last state assembly elections in Delhi, I think something like 80% of Delhi's Muslim population voted for the Aam Aadmi Party in concert. And what happened was that when the Northeast Delhi riots happened, the Aam Aadmi Party disowned its Muslim supporters completely, and in fact went out of its way to suggest that stern and condign action would be taken against these people. I mean, even political figures who most people conceptually thought would be sympathetic to the plight of Muslims who were substantially at the receiving end of this violence, like Atishi Madlena and so on, seem to be conspicuously unsympathetic. So here you have the perfect example of this, where you need Muslim support to win elections, but you don't want to acknowledge that that constituency because you feel it might damage you with other voting groups. And how you deal with it is not a question that's above my pay grade. I don't even know. I think you have to be. I think there are two ways of doing it. One, does the electoral arithmetic add up with or without Muslims? The other is whether it's possible to find imaginatively and rhetorically a way of seeming both inclusive and being committed to a general good that can't be associated with pandering to a particular minority. That requires, as Akar pointed out, charismatic politics. It involves that magical something that is hard to do if you are a political pundit or someone who does election polls, because the ability to find a message, for example, if you look at Shashi Tharoor's position on the Sabarimala thing, you can see him very carefully trying to walk a tightrope about, was the conservative position good or bad? And he finally says that you should allow traditions not to be interfered with. I think partly he's doing this partly because he doesn't want to be pigeonholed as someone who is progressive in a way that offends traditional-minded Hindus within the state. So it's a tightrope that politicians walk all the time, but politics can't be a series of tightropes to be walked. In the end, political parties have to find rhetorical and principled political positions that succeed in not compromising their principles, but at the same time indicating that their focus is broad enough to be a broad church and not one that is mortgaged to a particular demography.
So I wanted to ask one more question. So you had referred to the necessity of a new leader or a movement to redeem or recapture the legacy of the Congress. So how do you look at Bharat Jodo Yatra from that perspective? Because recently this Yogendra Yadav, the psephologist, was referring to Rahul Gandhi as an embodiment of Nehruvian ideals as well as Ambedkar's movement of social justice. So how would you look at Bharat Jodo Yatra as a movement to recapture the Congress legacy?
First of all, let me just freely admit that this talk of redemption and political imagination is partly an indication of how beleaguered progressives are in terms of the political situation of India today. Because it's not usual for people to look for a charismatic redemptive leader. They're not available on mail order. But I think the reason why we began to think in these terms is because you see the inverse of this. You see someone like Modi, who pollsters will routinely tell you will add 10% to his party's vote share simply by being there, simply because he has managed, in a sense, to create this protean persona, which combines both death and development, in a way that creates pluralities. So I think the reason why to talk about charismatic leaders or leaders of political imagination is a shorthand for saying that the left, or whatever one thinks of as the opposite of majoritarianism, needs to find a politics that is, to use a bad word, populist in a progressive way. How do you throw enough red meat to your potential electors to enthuse them about you, instead of making merely narrow calculations about electoral activity? Sorry.
Sir, I was asking about Bharat Jodo.
Oh yes, about I think it's something that's generally accepted that Rahul Gandhi gets a bad press simply because he is a dynast who can be easily classified as such, and he belongs to a political party that has been on a long downward curve. And sometimes much of this is unfair. That Bharat Jodo Yatra, I'm not sure that I'd be able to tell you what the impact of it was, but I certainly know that it brought the Congress back into the news, where it was not before. And there's something sort of admirable about this very unlikely politician in a too tight t-shirt, sort of walking up and down India. The thing about Rahul Gandhi is that he is admirable in many ways. He's also a victim of his political heritage in others. But I think it would be fair to say that it's difficult for anyone to imagine him as the charismatic head of a large coalition. To the extent that people do imagine a coalition with the Congress in it, I think even though he leads the largest opposition party there is, if he was up for the Oscars, it would be for Best Supporting Role.
Make it brief, please. Why Indian secularism remains weak in tackling Hindutva, and what about the negation of Gandhi in post-independent years by the Congress? Two questions.
I think the first question is unanswerable, because I would just say that it's a mistake to see it in terms of secularism, because I don't think secularism is a political stance that's ever had much political traction in Indian society. To the extent that we think of secularism, what we think of is a kind of promiscuous pluralism. No French person, for example, would recognize in India any form of secularism at all. So I think that's the wrong question. The question we have to ask is, why has this ideological pluralism that I was talking about, failed to assimilate within itself a large block of people who are nominally Hindu? And I think the answer to that question is not an essential question. It's not an essentialized answer. It's not as if there are Hindus have characteristics that other people don't. I think it's a question of how the exhaustive potential of an ideological agenda in the 1980s was replaced by, in my view, a more pernicious but more dynamic attempt to imagine an imaginary India which appealed to a kind of disillusioned electorate that felt that that the promise of freedom embodied by the Congress had failed. I don't think any state would be a negation of Gandhi. You can't establish a republican state if you are an orthodox Gandhian. I mean, and I think we should accept that Gandhi had enormously insightful things to say about violence and consumerism and the nature of modernity, but nothing he had to say about the way in which the state can be structured could conceivably be of any use to anybody who administers the state.
In Toni Morrison's Jazz Singer, after the concert, nobody leaves the auditorium because everybody feels that the singer has something more to offer. So we leave it there. Doctor has something more to offer, and we leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for moderating this. Thank you all for being so patient to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite Mr. Premjit Emma, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to hand over the token of gratitude to Dr. Mukul Kesavan.
Speaking, things like this get part in an adequate, but I'm looking at this at Akar's which has very glamorous photograph on it. And I'm grateful to have a photograph in mind less glamorous for this, but it's really quite lovely to have something as 10-50% nice. Thank you very much.
As we come to the end of this enriching conference, let us take a moment to express our gratitude to everyone who made this event a success. For that, I welcome Siddhi Suresh to propose the word of thanks.
I stand before you to express my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you who had made this program a resounding success. First and foremost, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our chief guest, Dr. Mukul Kesavan, for graciously accepting our invitation and delivering a thought-provoking lecture on the Nehruvian state and pluralism. So, your insight and expertise have enriched our understanding of this critical topic. Secondly, I wish to thank our moderator, Professor P. Harishankar, former professor and head of the Department of English, Pandalam. I would also like to thank our principal, vice principal, and head of the Department of English for the guidance and support. A special mention to Premjit sir and Amit sir, whose contribution have been invaluable to the success of this program. To all the participants and teachers who have traveled from different colleges and states, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for your participation and enthusiasm. Also, thanks to all the participants for your active involvement in the Q&A session. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the entire organizing committee for their hard work and dedication. Thank you.
Thank you, Siti. Now we have come to the end of second plenary session, which has been arranged in the auditorium. You are welcome to proceed now and kindly return by 1:30 p.m. at Seminar Hall. Thank you.